Scott, thank you for joining us. Very interesting take on the whole hullabaloo around Bucha. Some horrible things did happen there, bringing up the question of, hey, let's have some evidence before we decide what happens. Novel approach in the media. Maybe you could detail some of the things that you presented, for example, in the editorial at RT's website.
Well, I mean, some accusations have been made based around, I think about a dozen bodies that were discovered on a street in the Ukrainian town of Bucha, which is like a suburb north of Kiev. The Russians had occupied that town for a period of time, and as part of this withdrawal that they claimed they were making as a goodwill gesture, the town was recaptured by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians released a video showing bodies lying around. And the first thing that came out was these are bodies of innocent Ukrainian civilians murdered by the Russians, and this is proof positive of a war crime. And my first reaction is, well, stop. Especially if this is true. Especially if this is true. The first thing you do is you freeze the site and you say, oh my God, a crime took place. All right, stop all movement, don't touch anything, bring in the forensic dudes, and then treat it as a crime scene, process it as a crime scene.
Right, bust out tape and everything. Mark it off, stay out of here. Yeah.
You do what you have to do because you're calling it a war crime. And the implication is, I mean, where the way they've run with this is, they want to charge people. And I agree. Whoever perpetrated this should be charged. So you start with the forensics. Let's find out who they are. Let's get some identification. Are these Russian speakers? Are these Ukrainian speakers? Are these people who are from Bucha? Or are they, people who are transiting through? When did they die? I mean, that, right off the bat, you process the scene, you take a body, you do the autopsy, and you get a time of death. And you know what? Coroners are pretty darn good nowadays. They'll be able to tell you, give you a plus or minus a couple hours when they died. How did they die? I mean, were they shot? Is there gunpowder marks on the wound? Were they shot point blank? Were they shot at distance? What caliber weapon? Can you grab the bullet? Were they blown up by an explosive, grenade, a mortar round, artillery? How did they die? And did they die there, or were they moved? I mean, these are three just really, really basic questions. The other thing you do is you gather, corroborating evidence. For instance, what's around them? Were they carrying something? It appears that many of them were carrying the green ration boxes given by the Russian soldiers to civilians, dry rations. So if people are hungry, can't go to the store, the Russians have a humanitarian program where they hand out these dry rations. Many of the people appear to be wearing the white armbands on their arm that signifies, hey, we're not enemies to the Russians, meaning that if you approach the Russians, if you're with the Russians, you wear the white armband, it says, I'm not a threat. Because, the Ukrainians mobilized all these civilians and they gave them guns, they gave them missiles. And I'm sure the Russians have a case where somebody who looks like a civilian comes up, pops off a javelin, takes out a Russian vehicle, kills 4 or 5 Russians. So they're a little nervous. So you wear this, I'm not a threat. Things like that. You want to get other evidence. For instance, has anybody threatened to kill civilians in Bucha lately? I mean, did the Russians say do you have a radio call from the Russians saying, kill all the civilians? Or maybe you have a videotape made by a Ukrainian official telling the citizens of Bucha, stay at home, we're going to be running a cleansing operation to cleanse all of the collaborators. Oh, wait, that one actually exists. Maybe you have a videotape of Ukrainian National Police coming in and, oh my goodness, they actually caught him saying, hey, they're not wearing blue bands. Can I kill them? Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
maybe you have that. Maybe you have a press release by the Ukrainian police that say, we are going to be carrying out a cleansing operation. We're going to give a haircut to the collaborators. So this is supporting evidence. And then you bring it all together, and only then can you say, who do we want to focus this investigation on? Because I'm telling you right now, with all the available data, there's only one direction the accusatory arrow points, and that's towards Ukraine. But even with all this substantive corroborating data, I would hold off and say, I still need the forensics. And then I'd be asking Ukrainians, why aren't you doing the forensics? Why aren't you running the forensics? Why don't I have autopsies? Why don't I know their names? Why don't I know how they died? Why don't I know when they died? How long has it been? A week now? And we know nothing. So you have to ask yourself the question, why aren't they doing this? And the answer is they don't want the answers, because the answers are inconvenient to the narrative that they've been selling.
Right. The event has already been more or less fit into the narrative. You start with what's in essence war porn or violence porn, a shocking visual image that as somebody who's seeing it, you're defining it for them. You see horror, they tell you what that horror is. That fits right into the narrative neatly. The Russians did this, that's what they're doing. You said, now I've been looking at this for since we first started hearing about it last week. And this is the first time, after having a half-hour conversation with Mark Slobody yesterday, that I realized we're talking about a dozen people and not dozens or hundreds. Because when they say massacre across the media like this, the imagery of it is this is a snapshot of this whole event.
Well, it's dozen people on the street. I think if you go into the homes and stuff, you're going to find other bodies. So they'll make it a couple dozen. And then where the hundreds come from is the mass grave that was dug at the church, dug, by the way, by the Ukrainians to bury the dead from the battle, meaning that a lot of people died in Bucha. There was heavy fighting in Bucha.
It's a war.
It's a war. The Ukrainian government shelled the hell out of Bucha. The Russians were attacked there and they fired back. And unfortunately, if you're a civilian caught in the crossfire, you're going to end up in a mass grave outside a church and here's the other important thing. Why did they dig the mass grave? Because there's sanitary problems with bodies lying around in the open. They tend to swell up and burst. It's very unpleasant. What didn't we see on these bodies? We didn't see swelling bodies. We didn't see burst bodies.
Oh.
And if these bodies were killed, as they're trying to say, sometime on March 19th, I can guarantee you, having been around this sort of thing, that by April 2nd, we'd be looking at bloated bodies. We'd be looking at basically the Michelin tire man. The clothes starting to burst at the seams, maybe some bodies having burst and the putrid stuff coming out. Yeah, I'm being gross, but this is reality. Those bodies weren't that.
Right.
That's not what we were seeing. So those bodies were killed recently, not in the past. Because in the mass grave is evidence of what the people were doing with the bodies in the street. So everything that the Ukrainians are finding now, with the exception of a body under rubble or a body hidden in a crevice, I'm sure there's bodies been around for some time, but most of the bodies that they're pulling out of Bucha now that aren't in the mass grave are freshly killed bodies.
So let's do this a little bit too. That's an important aspect to this because the timeline doesn't fit the narrative.
No, look, the Russians say that they left on March 30th. And we have some corroborating evidence from the other side, the mayor of Bucha, who did a videotape on March 31st, basically saying, we're back, we got it, we own it, the Russians are gone, we're in control. At no time did he say, oh my God, the bodies are littering the street. But I'll give him defense on this one. This street was actually in a very contested neighborhood between Bucha and I think the northern Kiev suburb of Irpin. And maybe they hadn't reached it yet. Maybe they hadn't got there yet. But on April 1st, we have now the now that they have the town, remember the town had been occupied by the Russians. The Russians themselves say that they had a really good relationship with many of the people in the town, that they were exchanging dry goods for dairy products, and they were buying things from the store. They had a good relationship, good communication with a segment of the population in Bucha. And if you're a Ukrainian government, especially if you're one of these right-wing nationalists who dominate, for instance, the national police of Ukraine, this isn't simply surviving. You're now a collaborator.
Right.
So on April 1st, we have, and here's some other interesting things. We have a group called the Safari Unit. Remember that name, Safari Unit. The Safari Unit is part of the Ukrainian National Police. It's an amalgam of specialist units that are dominated by right-wing Nazis, and they suddenly released that we are going to be carrying out a cleansing operation to eliminate the collaborators. This is on April 1st.
Right.
On the same day, you have a Ukrainian politician, a female, in a space of just a few minutes, warning everybody, stay indoors. Don't be worried. The gunshots you're hearing are a cleansing operation. Don't be worried. Don't be worried. Wow. And then we suddenly bodies appear. And then on April 2nd, we get the videotape and they say, whoa, look what the Russians did. No, the chronology is quite clear. The Ukrainians are trying to say these bodies were there when the Russians were there.
Right.
And there's literally nothing to sustain that. There's a New York Times story. There's a civilian satellite group called Moxar, and they've been selling their imagery to the media now for some time. All those nice pictures you saw of the infamous 40-mile-long convoy, the Russian buildup beforehand and such. They have a satellite image of Bucha, and the New York Times contends that this satellite image was taken on March 19th.
Right.
They're building the whole case on that. There's some forensics people going through this that are in the process of taking this story apart based upon camera angles, shadow length, etc. And they've come back and said, no, this image couldn't have been taken on March 19th. This image was taken on April 1st, and they give the time. Well, now the April 1st data matches exactly what I believe the real narrative is. We have to withhold final judgment on that forensics until it's completed. They could be wrong, et cetera. But again, if you were to ask me, is it more likely that anti-Russian elements would fake satellite data to reinforce a point than a simple mistake? I'd say no. They are fully capable of faking data.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a simple mistake. I think they're in error, but journalists, especially people that come from an organization that has the cachet of the New York Times, you think would run their numbers, do their due diligence. Yeah. So any error that's been made is more an error in the likes of Judith Miller of WMD fame.
Right.
Meaning there was no error at all. It was a deliberate falsification to promote a narrative that the newspaper had already bought into. And the New York Times has already bought into Vladimir Putin and Russia are evil.
Right.
And they may be. I'm not here trying to give anybody a clean bill of health. I'm simply saying that when you're going to report on an issue, it needs to be fact-based.
That's right.
And when you're dealing with a situation like was encountered in Bucha, there are certain ways to collect facts that make them usable, for instance, in a war crimes trial. In a war crimes trial, you don't bring rumor, innuendo, and manufactured data. You bring hard data. And that's not here. So we've already found them guilty in the court of public opinion. But my point is, if we're going to deal with reality, then we have to approach this the way a professional should approach this.
I mean, the facts that are available, to the extent there are facts available and to the extent that they're as they appear, are actually exculpatory. They're the kind that would raise reasonable doubt in a trial, as opposed to evidence of supporting the charge. And that's an important aspect too. Process matters. People don't look at process as being important. They look at it as, because we've been trained through TV, going off on a technicality. What was the technicality? The DA didn't have any evidence. Oh, that technicality. You go back to Colombo, to whatever's on TV now. First, they have the guys with the tape after the murder. Then they're taking up samples. This is back, Colombo's 1971 or whatever. They're getting cat hairs off the ground and cigar ashes. And from this, there are all kinds of deductions that are 98% accurate. You have overlaps of things in Vince, all this kind of nonsense. And now you make a case first for an indictment in front of a grand jury, and then in front of a jury. And you present evidence, and if you don't have the case, they're not guilty. And we're not even close to start. We haven't even put the tape up yet.
Well, look, you couldn't get an indictment off of this, let alone take it to trial. And and another important thing is chain of custody, things of that nature. You don't want to contaminate the scene. We already have videotape of the Ukrainians dragging bodies around with a rope. Now, again, unless you had already secured the scene, photographed the scene, and now I understand for instance, we're talking about war here, where the kind of war where retreating troops could booby trap a body.
Right. Yeah.
Been known to happen. We did it in Vietnam when on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Trust me, the Special Operations Group guys booby trapped a lot of bodies and laughed when it blew up because they knew they got somebody.
Right.
So could the Russians have booby trapped a body? Sure. So one way that people do in a field expedient manner is to tie a rope on the body and then drag it, see if the grenade rolls out and blows up, or if the landmine that's underneath it blows up. Whatever they want to do. So that could happen. But before that happens, you have to photograph the body so that if it does blow up, you take more photographs and you say, this happened because of this. This is a part of, all that evidence is collected so that you preserve the integrity of the crime scene. This crime scene has been trampled on, etc. No one can accept any data that's come out of this crime scene. None.
First of all, in a case like a war, and let's also just go to this one little place. It's one thing if it's a murder on Colombo or in the real world, or some other crime, a financial crime or whatever, and you're looking at evidence, and what you're trying to do is A, discourage this behavior in others, B, protect society from this particular perpetrator again, and then C, impose punishment for whatever sense of justice people need or whatever, revenge. That's in a regular criminal case. Here, what we're looking at is this is going to be used as an excuse to make war with Russia, a nuclear power.
Yeah.
You should be very sure of your facts before you start throwing gasoline on that fire, which is already burning.
No, I agree. Look, Ukraine doesn't care at this point. I think people need to understand that Ukraine is what they call a captured state.
Yeah.
And they were captured by an odious ideology that we America, together with the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, Canada, and others, sought to eliminate from the world in World War II.
Thought we did.
The Nazi ideology. It lives on in Western Ukraine. It was a minority. There's no doubt about it. But because of what we did in 2014 in facilitating the overthrow of a duly elected Ukrainian president who happened to be pro-Russian, Viktor Yanukovych, we empowered this hateful ideology. We turned it into a militarized hateful ideology. And if we've learned anything from history, look at the Russian Revolution. You had the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks, meaning smaller, were actually a bigger party. The Bolsheviks, meaning big, were actually a very small amount. But the Bolsheviks were violent as hell. And they took over everything through intimidation, fear, etc. So they ran the whole country with a minority of people who were Bolsheviks. the Banderists, the supporters of Stepan Bandera, this former Nazi Ukrainian nationalist who has the blood of hundreds of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Poles, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians on his hands, survived there. But in 2014, it went mainstream.
Yep.
And because of the violence brought in by these right wingers, nobody was willing to stand up to them. Nobody was prepared to say, no, not here, not in my backyard. Everybody just said, well, no, that this is nationalism. It'll burn itself out. Don't worry about it. Next thing you know, they had these military units running around killing Russians, terrorizing Russians, and now they inflamed the dragon next door, who woke up and said, no, we're not letting this happen. And now Ukraine has found itself where, its policies are being directed by these Nazis. And when they tried to take it, they couldn't, because nobody had the guts to stand up. Any president that said, hey, I want to do something that's good for Ukraine, but not good for the nationalists, was told by the nationalists, you'll be found hanging by the neck until dead. Now, normally when you threaten a president's life, that has a terminal effect on you,
right,
or it should.
That's right.
But it didn't. Instead, the president backed down every single time. In 2019, we see Zelensky, the famous videotape of him going to the front trying to impose a ceasefire, and having the Azov guys just mock him, say, get out of here. We're not doing it. We're not getting rid of our weapons. Who are you? I'm the president. We don't care. We're Azov. We run this show, not you. Our people are going to come and talk to you. What do you mean your people? I'm the president. No. We're going to talk to you because there's a way we do business. Yeah, what do you? Right. I'm the president. We don't care. You're not the president. You're nothing to us. And that was the reality. And he had to leave. He was humiliated. And so, and now we have a situation today where, Zelensky, who was elected with 78% popular vote,
right,
by the time on the eve of the war was down to 23%. This great vision of democracy, who's really nothing more than a comedian who's punching above his weight, handpicked by an oligarch to first play president on TV, and now he's going to transfer that because everybody looks at him and says, oh, you could be president. They made him president. He sucked at president, 23% support. How does he respond? He imprisons all of his political opposition.
Yeah, right.
And he shuts down all of the political opposition media. So he's no longer this wonderful promoter of democracy. And then because he's struggling, he goes to bed with the Nazis. He embraces them. He promotes them. He elevates them throughout government, throughout the police, throughout the military. And suddenly the Nazis are in total control. Ukraine is a captured state. That's just the reality.
Of one of the negotiators that he had sent to the negotiations with, or whoever sent to the negotiations for, with the Russians for peace, that apparently wasn't taking a hard enough line. They executed him pretty much on the steps of the courthouse.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly what happened there. There's some speculation that he might have been working for the Russians, or he could have just been. So we don't know. But the point is, normally in a situation like that, you have evidence. You bring it to a judge. The judge says, "Yep, we're going to sign an arrest warrant." You arrest him, charge him, try him. Give him due process to find out if what they're saying is true or not. And then if he's guilty, you impose a sentence and judgment on him. That's right. Instead, they just said, we find you guilty right now. Bam. And they killed him.
Shoot him near the courthouse. I guess that's sort of a concession to the process.
Well, it's also a signal.
Yeah, no
kidding. To everybody. If you step out of line, even 1 inch, it's your life.
Including Zelensky. The model you use of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is useful, but the real one in my eye is the one that the Nazis themselves, I wouldn't even want to say original, because these guys are old school. People have been calling them neo-Nazis, but they're more old school Nazis. They were a minority. They were a minority when they entered the government. They leveraged it. They had big sponsors like we do. They had like Krupp and a couple of other industrialists that were pushing them. And the view there was we can control them. Like the U.S. government was, we can control Osama bin Laden, for example. And then they light the fire.
Yeah, you can't control it. Yeah. You can't control hate.
Yeah, or madness. Yeah.
It's, and right now the thing is Ukraine's controlling us. I mean, we're in a situation where the United States, we're just giving them billions of dollars of aid. It's just willy-nilly. There's no really rhyme or reason for it.
Right.
It's done for domestic political purposes. But Ukraine is positioning us to, or we're using Ukraine to position. The bottom line is this isn't about Ukraine.
Yeah, right.
This is about a larger global geopolitical struggle between the United States and those world powers, which include Russia and China, that don't want to be playing the American game anymore.
Right.
And so, this is happening now. The U.S. set this up, but I don't think the U.S. anticipated the Russian response, because we weren't ready for it. We weren't ready for it economically, even though Biden claims to have sanctions plans in place, and we're running them. The world's being hurt more than Russia's being hurt. Biden bragged about destroying the ruble. Ruble's doing pretty darn good right now.
It's doing better than it was before.
Yeah, and the stock market, I crashed the stock market. No, it's actually doing quite well too. You know who's not doing good? Everybody else.
Everybody else, right?
Everybody else. Yeah. And you know who else is that we're supposed to be sending signals to? I mean, if this was my big plan to intimidate Russia, and I see it's failing. The last thing I do is turn to China and say, and we're going to do this to you.
Yeah, right.
You really think the Chinese are losing sleep over the prospect of America, declaring economic war on China? Because as weak as we are right now, China could shut off every switch.
Yeah, that's amazing. And whenever they talk about sanctioning China, to me, if you figure out how it shakes out, so China sends back all the stock certificates and the various secondary market financial instruments and the lawyers and the accountants and the PR people, and they keep the factories and the workers.
Yeah.
So we can eat, all this paper, and we can watch that for TV and read it for pastime, and they're building cars and TVs and toasters and whatever the hell else you need.
One of the arguments all along about why Russia and China couldn't break free of the control of the dollar was that it would cost too much. That nobody wanted to incur that cost. Well, we sort of made it really easy for the Russians. We seized their sovereign wealth fund.
Right. Yep.
And the Russians went, well, decision made.
Yeah, we'll afford it anyway. Yeah, right.
So what do we do now? Well, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to, while you guys operate on a dollar backed by debt, we're going to convert the ruble to the gold standard. Oh, by the way, we have all the world's gold we've been buying up for the last couple of years.
Right.
And then we're just going to make everything payable in rubles, and your dollar doesn't matter anymore. We're just not going to deal with it. Now, imagine if the Chinese decided, hey, the Americans are threatening us with the same thing they did to the Russians.
Yep.
So why do we wait to let them seize our sovereign wealth fund? Why don't we just dump the dollar
now
preemptively, just get rid of it and say no thanks? And then what do we have? We got nothing.
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 We got poverty. We're out of time. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Scott Ritter is a former weapons inspector. Your resume is too long to recite here.
That's all right.
And thanks a lot for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.